Thank you for the opportunity. I am a child psychiatrist at Tygerberg Hospital, and it's based at Stellenbosch University, Tygerberg campus. And I'm just want to give you a taster, which I think it's things that people are familiar with and that we've been hearing a lot about on the media and in discussions around mental health in the context of online learning. So we can start next. Right, so I like to start by saying that we need to face the reality. We're all exhausted from this upheaval in our lives due to the pandemic. And the reason for that is because primarily it's not your choice. And one of the main elements of having a good mental health is autonomy, which is really your right to choose, alongside self-expression, your sense of control. And the truth is that many of us have been sent home. We no longer have a choice to go to work or to go to school, or really to even work in a way that we're used to. And this lack of choice itself is what makes us frustrated and even a little bit disoriented. And it actually doesn't matter if you're the kind of person who likes engaging with people or prefers to be on your own, so an introvert or an extrovert. The disruption is unfortunately the same. And so we've come up with this idea now, which has taken the world by storm, that if we connect online, either over a video chat or a Zoom call, it seems like a good way to relieve the isolating aspect that everybody, children, students, and lecturers alike, have from working from home. However, what we're actually experiencing is a communication disconnect. And so the reality is being on a video call requires more focus than if you were in a face-to-face chat with someone. And during video chats, we need to work harder, and harder for a number of reasons, because we need to process nonverbal cues. So things like facial expressions, the tone and the pitch of the voice, as well as the body language, so tiny gestures. And paying more attention to these consume a lot of energy. Our minds are together, but actually our bodies feel we're not. And so it's a dissonance that is exhausting because you can't find yourself relaxing into a conversation naturally. And what it actually does is it reminds us of loss. So this video call itself is a reminder of the people that we've lost, even if it's just temporarily. It's the distress that every time you see someone online, whether that be a peer group at school or one of your colleagues at work or in the staff workplace, the aspects of your life that used to be separate. So the work, the friends, the family, suddenly everything is happening in the same space. So you're losing that separation, which is really important for your mental well-being. And that is really posited on what we call the self-complexity theory. And so what that means is that individuals have multiple aspects that are context dependent. So your social role, your mask that you put on in a social engagement, the relationships you have, intimate relationships with others, as well as professional ones, the activities, the goals. And all of this is necessary because variety is healthy. And when these aspects are reduced or lost, we become quite vulnerable, and vulnerable mostly to negative feelings. And one of the greatest things about working together is the regular connection you get. And connection doesn't necessarily mean with somebody you're used to or somebody you're friends with, but really somebody that you engage with that offers you an opportunity to stay connected and maintain relationships as a matter of fact. So not really that close, high impact relationship that you might have with someone at home or someone with a best friend, where you really are more invested in that relationship. So think about when you are at work. For example, if you're in a staff room, if there are lots of teachers that are available here, when you check in with your colleagues, they may not necessarily be your best friends, but it actually allows you a chance to make contact. So in a non-threatening way, just kind of checking in how you are, what you're up to, and in a general way, your mental state requires that. Now, the likelihood is that your network currently has been reduced. And so what you're missing are not just your friends, but your everyday contacts. So kind of the person you say hello to when you get your coffee, someone you see on the transport or your lift club. And what you're actually experiencing is some degree of grief. Whether you like it or not, work is fundamentally social. And even for those people who are more introverted, the human connection is the most important part of the work experience. So you're exhausted now because you're not energized by these regular connections, and because maintaining these connections requires a more conscious effort. Why are we really all so tired? One of the most common non-physical causes of fatigue is anxiety. So this pandemic has made people more confused, more uncertain. It's a whole world of unpredictability. And given that, we have a sense of trepidation. One of the main core instincts in terms of anxiety-provoking experiences is this idea that you're now on stage. When you're in a video conference, you know everybody's looking at you. And there comes a social pressure, feeling like you have to perform. And being performative is nerve-wracking. It's more stressful, more especially if you're the kind of person who at baseline has some kind of performance anxiety. And we see that a lot in children who aren't necessarily used to standing up in front of an audience, who find things like oral presentations extremely anxiety-provoking. The other thing is multitasking. I mean, let's be honest. How many of you listening to this presentation now are actually just listening to the presentation? You're probably checking your cell phone. You're looking in quickly at your email inbox. You're trying to scroll through your Instagram. And the problem is, it's easy to think that you can use an opportunity to do more in less time. But trying to multitask and do multiple things at once cuts into the performance and increases your anxiety. If we're talking about performance, we have to talk about overperforming, where you don't really have downtime. This online accessibility now means that you're available all the time. It's kind of like a doctor on call, where it goes beyond the normal workday hours, where all of a sudden we have this uncertainty of the sustainability of our positions. And this is particularly problematic in work environments, where we have this desire to outperform the next person because we know our jobs might depend on it. This contributes to overextending the work commitment, poor balance socially, ultimately increasing anxiety. I had a colleague at work who was saying that, it was so ridiculous. She was trying to get hold of the teacher and it was 10 o'clock and that was the time she had. And the teacher was online, but wasn't really answering. And so that gives you a good idea of how all of a sudden being available for an online service suddenly makes you on call, but without any prospect of having a downtime. And part of that effect is really on your sleep. So because you're never really switching off, you're always checking your phone or checking your inbox to see, was there a question? Did a student only have an internet connection later at night? And so you don't want to disadvantage them, so you check again. And why that really makes it problematic is that you actually experience more blue light stimulation than usual. And the problem with that is that it alters your circadian rhythm. And if your circadian rhythm is affected, it leads to a more disruptive sleep pattern and ultimately poor sleep cycles. And ultimately, that then leads to a worsening of mood and anxiety. The other big elephant in the room that we have to talk about is the silence. So silence creates a natural rhythm in real life conversations. So we as human beings, we communicate even when we're quiet. So during an in-person conversation, the brain focuses partly on the words that are being spoken, but also looks at other things. So lots of non-verbal cues, like whether someone's looking at you directly in the eye, whether they're distracted. If someone says something in a meeting, is your colleague across the table rolling their eyes in horror? Is someone fidgeting while you talk? All these cues help you as a human being to paint a holistic picture of what's being conveyed and what's expected. The problem is a typical video call will impair these ingrained abilities. It requires you to have a more sustained, attentive response to the words. And we realize we don't only need words to understand what somebody's trying to say. The problem again in a video call with silence is when there are moments of silence, you suddenly become anxious. You think, is the technology a problem? Is my connection poor? Are people uncomfortable with what I'm saying? It makes people perceive you as less friendly, less focused. Do I need to suddenly contribute to something? And so the silence takes on the opposite role to what it's supposed to do. You've probably all heard about Zoom fatigue. It's quite a trendy word at the moment. And what this really means, if we break it down, is how we process information over the video, in this case, Zoom, which seems to be one of the most commonly used platforms. On a video call, the only way to show that you're paying attention is to look at the camera. But in real life, how often do you stand this close to someone and stare at their face constantly? Probably never. And this is because having to engage in a constant gaze makes us feel quite uncomfortable, quite tired. Think about the last time you stood opposite someone that you were having a conversation with. Very often we use our peripheral vision. So we glance out of the window, we look at the cars going by, we might notice something else in the environment. But because we're sitting in different homes in a video call, if we tend to look out of the window, something completely normal, we might worry that it looks like we're not paying attention. Somebody might look at you and say, did I say something that kind of lost you there for a minute? Are you sure you're still online? The other problem we don't talk about is that additionally to the fact that we aren't kind of looking outside at our peripheral vision, is that most of us are staring at a small window of ourselves. And I don't know about you, but for me, it makes me hyper aware of every wrinkle, every expression. Is my lipstick okay? How might it be interpreted? And without the visual breaks that we need to refocus, these things we subconsciously do when we distract ourselves, our brains grow more fatigued. So the question is, how can we help ourselves survive without really making this a negative experience? And the simple thing to do, I liked what the teacher before that said, was take time during an online session to catch up before diving into work. And that's really important, because spending time to actually check into someone's mental well-being as a way to reconnect us with the world is really important. It helps you to maintain trust, it reduces fatigue and concern, and it gives a kind of lightness to that engagement that otherwise is quite lacking if we're just relying on this technology to transmit our feelings. And limit video calls to those that are absolutely necessary. So again, turning on a camera in a large-scale group like this one should be optional. And in general, there should be more understanding that cameras don't always have to be on throughout a teaching session or meeting. And that's really important when we think about young children who need to be given the opportunity to be able to not feel as anxious and judged as they would be if they were facing you all the time and having other people look at them. Having your screen off to the side is also a useful thing to do. So instead of staring straight ahead, it also helps your concentration, particularly in group meetings. So it's almost as if you're talking to someone that's a little bit ahead of you rather than directly in front of you. And in some cases, it's really worth considering if video chats are really the most efficient option. And now it's kind of like, I heard someone also say that we need to think about hybrid ways of teaching. And that's a really useful thing to consider. Because if we had to share files, for example, with clear notes, those could be a better option that avoids information overload, especially in young children who don't really have the ability to cognitively disseminate things in clear categories. So they often will get overwhelmed by information and they lose attention. It's the mistake we make when we think that kids don't pay attention because they have ADHD. Not necessarily always so. It might be that we're just constantly bombarding them with information that doesn't allow them, or their developing brains don't allow them, to separate and segregate what's important and what's not. So it's kind of like a filter that still needs to be developed in a young person. And building transition periods between video meetings, that also is really helpful. So have a stretch, have a drink, do a little bit of exercise, especially with online schooling. And we forget that it's this intermittent separation of the learning environment that helps children refocus. So if we're having, one lesson at 9 o'clock, the next one at 10 o'clock, the next one at 11 o'clock, we have to also remember that in a normal day-to-day classroom situation, that's not really what's happening. A 40-minute class might actually just be 30 minutes and of of teaching, and the rest of the time is actually allowing children to engage socially. And if you think about the lockdown, that's really what's giving us the most amount of concern when we think about children's mental health and well-being. It's the disconnect between them being able to still engage in a social way. We make a mistake by thinking school is just about academic performance or about sport. Schooling is also a way of children learning from each other. So that shared social emotional experience can only come if they're given that opportunity to engage. So this really reinforces for us that the boundaries and transitions are so important. We need to be able to create buffers that allow us to put one identity aside and then go into another as you move between your work and your private persona. And I think that's the last slide. So thank you very much.